As a music educator of many years, I just want to say that I hope we all realize that the work that all brought us here is 2 or 3 years in the preparation. It's been a huge project, and I want to give everybody another round of applause. About 12 years ago, I decided that I was going to try to tweak a little bit our understanding of why the art schools or school at Hull-House closed. It's a really complicated question. I want to explain why. Instead, what happened is I found myself jumping down a rabbit hole and trying to sort out some of the biographical information about Ellen Gates Starr, because Hull-House had 2 co-founders, and Ellen Gates Starr is the one we know the least about. She, in her obituary, all of her obituaries quote her as saying, "The cause of art is the cause of the people." And I've decided today to try to pull together some of our thoughts by finding where that came from. So, to understand how Ellen Gates Starr could both be an artist, and we see here a very famous portrait of her holding one of her beautifully bound arts and crafts books, but also a street activist, that's her mugshot in the middle, and also a socialist politician. You have to understand where her governing ideas, beliefs, and motivations for work came from. And they came from several people. I can only give you 3. John Ruskin, very famous social philosopher, aesthetician, mostly known as a weird Victorian, was a powerhouse of social change in London, and in Britain, as a whole. Among other things, he was the founder of the Ruskin Museum of Craft, which Ellen Gates Starr visited in Sheffield, England. Here's one quote from him. "The only recovery of our art power possible must result from the purification of the nation's heart and the chastisement of its life, utterly hopeless for our adult population in our large cities. But for the minds of the young, the foundation of a new dynasty of thought may slowly be laid." He was talking about the UK, but the same problems of industrialization and slum life and depravity were here too. So I give you this quote not just because he said it, but because Ellen Gates Starr quoted it in her publications and in her lectures. Another, you know probably less well, Thomas Horsfall, you'll hear about him more. He says, "For all modern communities, the decision as to whether art shall be an education is of much importance. In fact, it is in fact a decision as to whether the people shall be barbarian or civilized." You'll see below his portrait his art gallery in the slums of Ancoats, started in 1877, a precursor and a motivator behind Hull-House's interest in the arts, and beside it, the building in which it is housed, which was also the house of the Manchester University Settlement House, which was founded after Ellen Gates Starr went and spent 11 days with him in Manchester. And then thirdly, William Morse. 300 years has not changed man's nature thus utterly. One day we shall win back art. That is to say, the pleasure of life. Win back art again in our daily labor. Where is the hope then, you may say? There is the hope. The cause of art is the cause of the people. Now, Ellen Gates Starr knew Morse, she knew Horsfall, and she almost certainly didn't know Ruskin, but she read him heavily because Ruskin was an important part of the curriculum when Jane Addams and Ellen Gates Starr and their friend Sarah Anderson were students at Rockville Seminary, which was a school that trained women to live their faith in action. It's now Rockford University. On the famous journey that Jane and Ellen and Sarah made together, not at the same time, but on different occasions, Sarah and Jane and then Ellen went and visited Toynbee Hall, the first original settlement house built in London, and spent time with its founders, the Barnetts. You'll see a picture of its historical first building, now under reconstruction, a picture of the Whitechapel Art Gallery, which was part of its educational plan, and a portrait of Charles Ashby, a monumental figure in the arts and crafts movement and in the humane industrial movement in England. More about that later. So, when Hull-House was begun, and you've seen this lower picture because it's significant several times, there was the mansion, and then there was the Butler Art Gallery. And the first thing that went into the Butler Art Gallery were borrowed works of art from many of the affluent sponsors of Hull-House and their friends. Some of those works ended up at the Art Institute. What was also exhibited was the collection of very fine, commissioned engravings of the Turner paintings in John Ruskin's collection, paid for by Thomas Horsfall, to be spread all over the UK to schools in underprivileged areas that needed fine works of art and visions of nature, and he gave a set to Ellen to bring back to Hull-House. Now, the idea of Hull-House from the start involved art in life, and for Ellen Gates Starr, art was never for art's sake, art was for life's sake, and it was for society's sake. So attention to particular works was not so much important as following the idea and where it led them. Hull-House from the beginning had the intention of including art from cradle to near the grave. And so we have a famous picture of the nursery with fine quality reproductions from Raphael, so the infants would be influenced by beauty and order. And the Labor Museum, which I am daring to say we will begin to understand Ellen had more of a hand in than we have known in the past, which was a demonstration museum where senior crafters from different immigrants who came from different countries practiced their crafts and demonstrations and were paid for it. Now, I know that this session focuses on book art, so we're going to come back to how it happened that Ellen Gates Starr became a bookbinder and started teaching bookbindery. But first, I want to look at some of the other ways that she put into practice the idea that art through education needed to be experimented with in every way possible across Hull-House and in other like-minded institutions. She was for a while, the manager of the art programs at art school. She always, in her time in Hull-House, had a hand in the curriculum of informal and extension learning, and it always had arts in it. The art schools included drop-ins for street kids, vocational training for the likes of young man in the second picture, Peter Verberg, and others, like the ceramics lessons later, which would lead, hopefully, to gainful arts employment. Classes for, we heard, I'm trying to think, who was the Frances Lesner, who studied metalwork. Well, other fine ladies came to Hull-House in order to study bookbinding and other art forms, and many of them stayed. The third figure in the image happens to be my great aunt, but I didn't know that till I was 6 years into this project. And she went on to run the Russian immigrant program here at Hull-House and became a resident. It's an interesting insight that my family says Auntie Cora was a very nice lady who never lifted a finger in her life. And then the fourth image, there were curricular programs, art programs taught out of Hull-House and in Hull-House for school-age children. The configuration of what the art schools were changed over the years because the arts at Hull-House was an experiment. It also was largely dependent on who was available to do the teaching and what their interests were. Starting in its first year, Ellen herself delivered lecture courses on John Ruskin, on William Morris, on Dante in contemporary Florence, in English and in Italian, and on ancient architecture. And this was part of the range of the much wider courses available in economics, health, all kinds of things that young adults could come and learn, as well as language courses, citizenship courses, and so on. She was a very important essayist. She published articles in narrow and wider journals and in the newspaper on arts in the public schools. the craft of Irish weavers, that is, after she went to Bristol and met the woman who was bringing the weavers to the Chicago World's Fair. Art and democracy, art and labor, the renaissance of handicraft, bookbinding, a 4-series complete curriculum in the training of bookbinding. And in her later life, religious works which talked about the importance of artistic experience to spiritual life, including a famous essay called Two Pilgrimage Experiences about the island of Iona and Whitby. As the founder and first president of the Chicago Public Arts Association, she ensured, through the assistance of the affluent members of the Hull-House community, that original works of art of fairly high quality and very fine reproductions were distributed first to the Polk School and then to about 30 schools by her midlife, and the Public School Art Association existed into the 21st century, delivering art programs and original works of art into Chicago's public schools. This is a sample of those that she found particularly appropriate to young people, and they're pretty varied actually. And you'll notice that one of the materials we have in her papers is her copy of Thomas Horsfall's essay, The Use of Pictures in Education. Here are a few of the people who came to visit Hull-House. They were all friends of Ellen Gates Starr's, and one of the things that I've realized is that if you add up the time that she spent in the UK and on the continent, it's somewhere between 3 3/4 and 4.5 years, starting in 1887-8, 1891, and or 1892, it's either 1 trip or 2, 1898, 99, 1900, 1906 or 7, 1914, and 1924. And she wasn't on vacation. Her friends included among, oh God, I've got a glitch in there. Her teacher, we'll hear more about in a moment, T.J. Cobden Sanderson, the man who gave the arts and crafts movement its name, and his wife, Annie Cobden Sanderson, who you see on her arrest postcard as she is delivering the petition for the rights of women to vote to 10 Downing Street, which landed her in Holloway prison. These are the people that Ellen lived with for 15 months. Samuel and Henrietta Barnett, who she didn't just meet once, she lectured for and led one of their Easter trips for East Enders, working class people, to Italy, and she was the lecturer. Charles Ashby, who was the architecture instructor and the organizer of craft factories around Hull-House. And this is a really interesting thing. Does anybody know who took that photograph? Franklin Wright. And it was taken in 1900 at the Oak Park Studios. There's a long, complicated story, but 13 years later, Frank Lloyd Wright asked Charles Ashby's help by asking him to write the introduction to his first publication of architecture in 1913, which had to be published in German because that's where he found a publisher. So there's a really strong friendship between Hull-House and Frank Lloyd Wright, Tom here, and Ellen. Mae Morris, daughter of William Morris, who spent a month here on a 4.5-month lecture tour, the longest other visit being 2 days and then a week or 2 in New York. Patrick Geddes, who most of you have probably never heard of, I hadn't, but he is one of the people that 6th graders and 12-year-olds in the UK learn about. He's the man who gave us the phrase, think globally, act locally, in 1879. And he was also the principal investigator for Andrew Carnegie as he founded the Carnegie Foundation. 2 minutes, okay. John Duncan, Hull-House painter, and Sylvia Pankhurst. We've talked about the Labor Museum, and I know we're going to hear more about it, but I wanted to say that what you're looking at is the newspaper article in the Manchester Guardian about Ellen Gates Starr's role in the founding of the Labor Museum. At the Hull-House Bindery, Ellen decided that if she was going to teach arts, she had to learn arts, and she made herself an apprentice, where she learned for 15 months very, very precise, detailed bookbinding skill, for the purpose of coming back and teaching it. You have to keep in mind that the arts and crafts was not a style, it was a social movement, and that she learned this from T.J. Cotton Sanderson and from Annie. Here are a couple of her books. Beautiful examples. This is the year she was made a master, in 1900. A volume of Keats' poetry, booked and boxed in 1928, which is a historical footnote because most histories say she stopped finding books about 1920. I would like it if anybody wants to buy me this. This is currently on sale. A 5-volume embossed, look at the front cover. Okay, an embossed set of the Dove's Bindery, T.J. Cotton Sanderson's Bible, which she bound. And then this, about 2 weeks ago at the Ruskin Library, an assistant handed me the book in black and said, "Would you like to look at this?" It was an unattributed book given by Cotton Sanderson to the John Ruskin's personal library while Jane was an apprentice. It's not embossed with her insignia because she's not a master, but heck, it looks an awful lot like the Ellen Gates Starr, with the same tools used and the same impress and the same decoration from 1902. I think we found an Ellen Gates Starr book in John Ruskin's library. Now, teaching at the Bindery, she taught students like Peter Verberg, who went on to be professional bookbinders and artists, and society ladies like my Auntie Cora, producing, if you see the lower corner here nearest me, this is a copy of the Kelmscott Press, William Morris Chaucer, one of the most precious books in bookdom, which Mrs. Wilmarth, who you heard about earlier, bought so that Ellen and her student could bind it, and it is currently in a glass case at the Fortnightly Club. And then the works of her students, all the process. But she did other things, and this is what I get into 1 minute. In 1895, she was invited to the Chautauqua Institute, if you know about this, lifelong learning on Lake Erie and elsewhere, as the first art history instructor. She only lasted a year because the next year they hired a guy. She lectured in both these pavilions that did art criticism about works. She went to Birdcliff, which is the first art colony, arguably, in New York State, where the Woodstock concert was, founded by a man up above is Ralph Ratcliffe Whitehead, who was a student of Ruskin, and below Hervey White, who was a resident of Hull-House and an author. She, Ellen, John Duncan, the painter, Peter Verberg, all went and signed in on the first day as part of the founding core of Woodstock Birdcliff. She also taught art, but she also taught Russian socialism classes through the high Anglican quasi-conventish secular group called the Companions of the Holy Cross in Allen Rood, Massachusetts, from 1892 to 1919, every summer unless she was in Europe. And you see her leaning up against a tree with the founder and the famous Vita Scudder of social Christianity, discussing what they're going to teach that year. And then this is the final one. In 1917, April, Ellen Gates Starr was invited by her friend Charles Wager to come lecture at Oberlin College. And she loaned her books to the last exhibition, 6 of them, to the last exhibition in the little academic gallery they had in an old building that's long since been torn down, as a prelude to the opening of the great, still existing, Cass Gilbert Oberlin Museum called the Ellen Art Museum. In May 1st of 1917, after her lectures on bookbinding and William Morris, the Board of Trustees was deciding whether to put across the heading of the building, across the architrave, Phidias, Leonardo, Tiepolo, you get the picture, okay? Or approaching art is the approximation of approaching God. They couldn't decide, they had a split vote. The masonry carver was demanding that they tell them what motto, because the building was going to open in June. And 5 weeks after she was there, what went up was the cause of art is the cause of the people. Thank you.
David mentioned there was a lot of music here at Hull-House. And I just felt we had to hear a piece of music composed by Eleanor Smith, who ran the music school here for at least 40 years, and was a Chicagoan or an Illinoisan who ended up in Chicago and was trained as well in Berlin. And I want you to hear this. You have to hear this because hearing it says so much. It is a labor song. It is called The Sweatshop. It is, the words were from a poem by a Yiddish tailor, Moses Rosenfeld, who was one of the Yiddish poets on the left, and probably a pretty radical man, and who was a tailor by trade. He had come from New York to Chicago to live, and living in the Hull-House neighborhood, which was also the garment sweatshop neighborhood of Chicago. And the children who sang this song, who were trained to sing it, were singing German Lieder when they narrated the conditions of work in the sweatshop. So here, let's see if we can. All right, it's hooked up. All right. I don't want to waste too much time moving along. It's wonderful. Okay, now let's get rid of this. Great. Oh, where's my, oh, okay, there it is. Okay, now, my remarks today are based on the research for my book, Eleanor Smith's Hull-House Songs, The Music of Protest and Hope in Jane Addams' Chicago, co-authored with sociologist Graham Casano and musicologist Jessica Payette, published by Brill. It's going to come out soon, where we just finished doing the proof text and the index. Okay. The book began with the very problem that this panel and the conference as a whole poses. What is the connection between art and labor? Ellen Gates Starr attempted, and we had some wonderful visuals and wonderful discussion about her so far, has attempted to answer what the connection was all about in her dual role as a labor activist who took to the streets to protest sweatshop conditions in the neighborhood, to strike with waitresses and get arrested for disturbing the peace. She rhetorically asked in 1895, given the deplorable social conditions, should we be offering art to the neighbors? And she answered, and this of course is paraphrased, precisely because working conditions are so terrible, we must find ways for our neighbors to participate in the arts. And that was crucial. It was a tension that never left her, that she lived with her whole life. And some of her excursions to Europe occurred in times when she needed to convalesce from the exhaustion of the extreme emotions she felt when she was involved in the labor agitation. Sometimes she had nervous breakdowns. She was a complicated, passionate person, and she, I think, personified in her own body, in her own life, the real complexity of what was attempted here in a very great and dramatic way by herself and her college friend, Jane Addams. So Jane Addams came to the conclusion that workers and children benefited from participation in arts and crafts in important ways. And she was able more readily to reconcile some of the issues that disturbed Ellen. But she too had issues that continued in her lifetime about the inconsistencies, the contradictions that really existed when educated people attempt to work with the people, so-called, to transform social conditions. And they change, they're life changers. They're changing life. They're changing, if you read the wonderful interviews that are in the special collections at the Daily Library here at UIC, you will get between the lines and directly the fact that when you began to get involved in Hull-House, when you bit the apple, your whole relationship to your own family and to the neighborhood changed. And this was important, but it was a great responsibility on every side. For Addams, art and craft became a form of politics. The Labor Museum was the site for arts and crafts participation. Industrial shops and the pottery kilns educated neighbors without the trappings of school or classrooms. Instead of teachers, adult neighbors were the leaders, demonstrating skills as artisans. There were, of course, lectures on the history of textiles or woodworking, metallurgy, printing. These set the stage for the performance of the craft. Timelines on the walls showed how people of different nationalities shared the evolution of craft. Jane Addams loved it that in one room she could show off the spinning techniques of a variety of different nationalities, a Syrian, a Russian, Irish, and so forth. And this made her feel that people could participate in acknowledging the historical relationships they all had with each other, and that somehow would be a way to socialize industrial conditions, to obviate the issues of alienation of labor in factories. And so she had this image of what it was she was doing in this labor museum, and it was very political. And I was talking last night with Nicole Marroquin, Am I saying her name right? Yes, wonderful. Ms. Ramses, who's working with a group of high school students at Benito, Juarez High School, talked in a way that absolutely Jane Addams would have said, yes, yes, wonderful, I agree, about a project she was doing, because this is what it was about. Her students were doing handiwork. They were making models of their own houses, the places where they resided in their family unit. And they were learning at the same time about the materials of these houses. And then they were making maps. And then they were making timelines. So they knew the history of the block, of the house, its genealogy in Pilsen. And then they were connecting it to Chicago. This is what Addams wanted workers and immigrants to be able to do, to have a sense of community, to invent themselves in a historicist fashion, and to know who they were in a different way, in relational ways to each other, and to use all kinds of arts and crafts, anything and everything was done here, for this to happen. And this was what she meant by participatory arts. I don't know if she ever used the word participatory. To think about it. Does anything? Okay. One of the most dramatic expressions of Addams' approach to using art to connect with the laboring of the neighbors came out of the Hull-House Music School. And you've heard the Eleanor Smith's composition, and the music students performed it. And the words were adapted, as I said. It is possible that some of the music students were themselves connected to the sweatshop and factories, and Addams and Ellen Starr were deeply engaged in the anti-sweatshop political battles in Illinois, along with Florence Kelley. And that most historians and scholars of Hull-House have emphasized and made a great deal about. But the fact that all the new music classes and the art classes and the other things that were going on here were really seamlessly connected to the project of politics and advocacy of anti-sweatshop legislation. That somehow gets lost. That connection isn't made enough of. And we know, on the other hand, so much about Florence Kelley, so little about Eleanor Smith. And so this is a very important conference that we're having here, because really community work and community center work, which goes on beyond Addams and beyond even the old-fashioned way of looking at settlement houses that we're doing today, is still about these basic questions. And so we can learn so much from what was done here. And so this desire to share the world of immigrants and workers was in large part a response to the economic and political crisis that Addams and her colleagues believed Western democracies were experiencing. I think that we can draw parallels to where we are as well today. It was a response as well to the popular and commercial culture emerging. Jazz, blues, dance halls, movies, these new forms of popular expression were perceived as immoral and dangerous by Addams, who was conflicted over her recognition of the naturalness of the spirit of youth and the sex urge, and her fear of its unmediated, potentially dangerous expression in the modern city, where old village customs of social control no longer existed. So there was a push and a pull as to what would be the content of the art that was practiced here. What would be the literature read? What were going to be the plays? Stuart Hector, I see there, quotes, I think, talks about Alex Ellison from his oral interview. That's wonderful. And I don't know whether it's Stuart who saw it or I saw it, but one of the things that Alex Elson says, and I think it's very pertinent here. He said, was it democracy? Were our classes with Edith and Ann Creed and our clubs, was it democratic? Oh no, she chose everything top down. She would say to us, oh, here's a couple of names, choose one. Here are a couple of plays. But the practice of being in charge of the narrative, which the actor then began to do, also changed even the dimension of the relationship between the teacher, Nan Creed, and the students. And that also comes out when you continue to read these interviews. The Hull-House settlement and its art programs for children and adults, the music school, the art school, the studios, the drama clubs, the crafts and pottery classes, all of these things, the choruses, the marching band, evolved as Addams realized how difficult it was to organize the Hull-House neighborhood for political reform and self-governance. Instead, she began increasingly to develop her ideas about a new kind of cultural pedagogy that would construct political and social awareness through the expression of arts and crafts. She found, especially with children, that drama was a medium where participants translated the narratives of their own lives into moral plays that projected a new idealism. Addams hoped to create community through neighborhood narrative. Sharing the common lot, which is what she often said was her reason for coming here, had radical and conservative implications. For Addams, the sweatshop, the song, and other labor songs composed by Eleanor Smith epitomized her approach. It was top down, unlike more typical kinds of labor songs. I don't think one could ever imagine a song like that being a labor song. It mediates class conflict by its form that adheres to the Western musical canon. And it is not surprising that middle-class women's clubs became the major audience for its performances. It was in the genre of Northern European cultural tropes, and its Yiddish origins were lost, as well as the radical roots of Yiddish culture among the garment workers in the neighborhood. So out of that juxtaposition, I'd like to just pose some questions quickly. Were the participatory programs, 3 plays, Italian operettas, etc., and I think David has already alluded to this and pointed to this question. All of this, did it actually encourage models of whiteness, thus mediating or moderating the incipient workers' unity and power economically and politically? We do not have any evidence of the of African American culture, blacks, and while after the death of Addams, and certainly by the late 1938-39, when there are lots of things changing here, we do see evidence of African American participation here. For the longest time, and in its heyday, this was not a place where the expression of African American culture occurred, even though Addams was clearly a race liberal. No question about it. And I'm working on this contradiction, this tension. Here is a woman who was a founder of the NAACP, yet a person like Hilda Sack-Polachek, who was a Hull-House girl, and we have her book, she learned about slavery and the problems of Jim Crow outside of Hull-House, and she brought it back in. What did she do at Hull-House? Well, she was a Polish Jewish girl, And she didn't know a damn thing about spinning or textile. And the craft had to be taught to her here. It wasn't something that she brought here in her overnight case when she came with her family. And that's an important thing to ask also. What craft do we assign to the different groups who come here? And how do we stereotype them by actually teaching them things that we think they would know or that should belong to them, as opposed to what they may or may not, have inside them? So that's the question. What's the difference between social change or transformation and social mobility? Do they reinforce or cancel each other? Was Addams accurate when she insisted that the social settlement was more transformative to the lives of the residents, the privileged women and men who came to live in the neighborhood, than it was for the neighbors? And I think that I'll end with this, the Garland story is a wonderful story because something happens here. The real change over time is that Sadie and Leon become residents and work with neighbors. They are neighbors as children who come to learn skills and to acquire cultural knowledge and social knowledge. Yet in the long period of Hull-House's existence, they are transformed and they transform the leadership of this place. So in the case of Nan Creed, the things that she does after her death in 1936 are carried on by the young adults who adored her and learned from her and continue to do as she had done, and so on. Michael Gamboni, after he returns from World War II, is appointed on the behest and on the advice of Dr. Alice Hamilton, who lives a very long life, who says, make Michael Gamboni the director of the art school. So there is a very interesting story here of transformation and change, but it's not exactly the one that I think Ellen Starr and Jane Addams might have scripted when they began. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone. It's a real honor to be in the midst of all of this history. The work that I do with North Branch Projects and as a bookbinder, I had no idea when I started taking this endeavor on about 8 years ago that it would have such relevant context as what we're talking about right now. Just to give you a little bit of background information about myself, these are some of the books that I make. I'm a visual artist and I'm trained mostly as a painter, but of course in art school you take on a bunch of other disciplines, sort of the nature of the industry. And I want to talk a little bit about what's going on here. These are all images that are books that we make at North Branch Projects, which is a community space that I started in Albany Park. If you're not familiar with Albany Park, it's a very diverse neighborhood up in the northwest side of Chicago. I grew up there with a mix of a good handful of people from all over the world. And it was interesting for me to have that relationship to the neighborhood because I always felt like it wasn't really the place where art was pursued. And for someone going into art school, I felt completely out of place with trying to create this kind of connection between art making, like creative practice, and books. So these images are some of the things that we've been working on over the years. And you can see the sort of particulars of this particular kind of stitch. This is a Coptic stitch and long stitch. If you're not familiar with bookbinding, it's very much kind of a slow, tedious process. And I bring that up because as far as a community endeavor, a community practice, it's such an important thing to slow things down in the world, and for me to present a craft and a kind of art making to the public, the people I was working with, was really the only way we could have a conversation with each other. So you can see some of these images. of us making things and some of the books that we've made. This one, this kind of silly image of the pizza book, I throw in there. It's very relevant because, and of course the book made out of a parking ticket is actually fairly relevant because part of the practice that we do is to introduce different types of materials that are readily available to the masses, so you don't have to spend a lot of money on materials. You can have a pizza and make something out of the cardboard, and you compare this to the materials and the craft of Ellen Gates Starr, and it's almost kind of a ridiculous contrast because her materials were so sort of fine and elegant. But my argument for presenting it in this way, especially with the people in Albany Park, was really to get them involved in the creative process, to expand their idea of what creativity could be. So rather than having to spend all this money on these expensive materials, they could really use whatever materials they had at hand. So we're a big advocate for recycled materials, things that you find, in your recycling bin, and things that you have readily accessible means to. And North Branch Projects really works on this idea of community binding. It's a term that I sort of coined back in the day when I was thinking of how to present the actual process of making a book. So this is an image of the storefront space in Albany Park. When we had it, it existed between 2010 and 2014. So it's kind of a short-lived 4.5 years of my life, and it was completely immersed in kind of running and maintaining a physical space, which is a financial drain, as you can imagine. But it was an interesting spot on Lawrence Avenue. If you're not familiar with that neighborhood, it's got all sorts of import-export shops. It's got all sorts of Latinx restaurants. There used to be what was coined Soul Drive, so they had a lot of Korean businesses, including a sort of long-standing but now defunct kimchi shop, and all sorts of other really interesting shops from all over the world. And you can see the space. We occupied about 2,500 square feet, and in the front was really kind of a questionable existence. People would pass by and not really know what we were doing. And I constantly think about these community spaces like the Hull-House, which seemed more official than the sort of street-level storefront spaces. People would come by and ask us what we were doing, if we were a coffee shop or a cafe. And I think that was sort of the beauty of it, is that we existed, this sort of questionable thing, this entity that people did not really know what to do with. So that was our first draw. We would get these people to knock on our door and ask us, what is it that you guys do? So a father-son, pair walking down from the grocery store at the end of the day would do just that, and then we would introduce them to this idea of making books. So you see these next few images are just some of the projects that we were working on. It was sort of an incredible surprise for me and for the few people who took part, because they suddenly realized that this was an open forum space where we could have things like writing workshops. This is the Chicago Writers House participating in the class. We had all of this wall space, so we ended up inviting people to exhibit their work, even if they weren't necessarily artists, but to engage somehow in the activities that we were doing. We had all sorts of, over the years, some schools, of course, participating and getting engaged in some of the community binding efforts that we were doing to talk about what art education was in this particular type of neighborhood. Like DePaul University, Columbia College, pretty much all the schools locally, Northeastern Illinois University, North Park, including a bunch of other arts organizations like the Chicago Humanities Festival and Uniting America. So, while we presented ourselves as a bookbinding facility and space, and I think this is always one of my favorite photographs of the Central Autonomo, which was the Mexican Solidarity group down the street from us, just sort of showed up and brought all their kids to make books with us. It sort of exemplifies the love of this craft, engaging people. And I want to focus on just this image, if you could indulge with me for a moment here, what's going on in this table, at this table. These people gather around with a mess of materials and things that they're manipulating and holding on to and figuring out what to do with. It's all part of this sort of love of the craft and using your hands and seeing what you could do as a creative individual, or maybe not so creative individual who, you know, maybe thought you had any potential in making things. But lo and behold, you know, they would ultimately end up with this thing that they could take home with them, and then also make a second book that could be left at the space. You can see that bookshelf on the back, which was kind of a good example of what we call the neighborhood archive, a collection of all the books that people have made with us. So over the years, it had grown to, you know, a couple of hundred books, and slowly sort of built itself into all sorts of other projects, which I'll talk about in a minute. In 2014, we closed down the space due to financial concerns. I'm going to leave it at that. It was a much more tumultuous story with how I was paying for it, how I pretty much drained my bank account paying for it by myself as a working artist. But it's, again, one of these important issues that I bring up because having the means to run a place like that pretty much dictates how you're going to interact with the neighborhood. So we had to kind of come up with ways of interacting and fulfilling our mission. And even though we didn't have a space, we could still continue to do workshops and off-site pop-up situations like this. We've been, over the years, because of the work that we had done in the community, garnered some relevance with other arts organizations. So Lurie Garden invited us to the Millennium Park Choral Room. The Art Institute had us do an entire afternoon at their block party. We're always invited to different schools to visit classrooms and conduct community binding. Harold Washington Library has a really great Makers Lab, which invites us regularly to work with the community. And even places like Bikes and Roses, which is a community bike shop. So again, you're talking about places that normally wouldn't offer art or wouldn't offer a creative sort of outlet, would invite us to engage with their community because they were interested in what books could do. And as far as middle school in Cassis, France, when I was doing a residency, you know, this is the kind of thing where a small idea venture in Albany Park is now gone internationally as much as possible, and we've got one kind of lined up for Puerto Rico as well, hopefully in 2019. So because we don't have that space, I just want to showcase some of the work that's going on in the coffee shop pop-up situation that we did last December. Cafe Chien, which closed down. And then now we're at the Read Write Library offering community binding in the basement. So kind of going back to the roots of whatever space we could find to engage people. And you can see we're working with small groups of 2, 3, 4 people to large groups like the block party of 50. And part of the sort of evolving idea of this project, because we don't have the spaces to be out and present in different areas, so we constructed a handful of these, what we call roving pedestal stations, interactive stations, which are featured in the exhibition. If you're in the museum later today, you can see it up close, where people basically respond to prompts on these covers of the books, and they're allowed opportunities to write or draw inside the books. So these are just examples of us taking them out in the street, where now, again, we don't have the physical space, but we're out and present and local on the streets, interacting with people. These are at a couple of different street festivals that we were invited to participate in. And then, kind of evolving what those projects can ultimately become. So this idea of the pedestal, this roving station, a speaker's podium, so to speak, this project invites people to talk about divisiveness and share with groups of people who are invited to also read and speak. So this is all happening. This all happened at the Library Reading Gallery earlier in the year, where we had invited a handful of speakers to engage in that conversation, to just share ideas of divisiveness and their thoughts and feelings about it. And of course, it ultimately ends up in a workshop setting where we can introduce book making and the process of book finding. So I'm just going to leave it at that. One thing I do want to add is that this whole idea of books really came out of my love for book making and the connection that I had with my mother, who, when I was 34, which was several years ago, I had never actually engaged in a conversation about my artwork, even after 6 years of art school, with my parents. And my mother, who at that time, was looking through one of my books that I was about to install in the show, and didn't like to attend openings, of course, realized that the textures and the patterns that I had drawn in this book looked similar to one of her plants, her house plants. And instantly, we had this conversation, this very first conversation about art that would never have taken place had she not looked through this book. So that sort of profound moment for me of the importance of this tangible object that you could hold in your hand and you could flip through the pages and you could directly hand to someone to engage in a conversation meant the world to me, and it sort of opened up this much broader conversation of how we can connect with others. And that was really ultimately the basis of what we're trying to do at the Book Branch. I love to see all the parallels that was happening with Ellen Gates Starr. Everything that she was doing was on such a deep level of craft that it's interesting to see how people who don't normally consider themselves creative in this day have experienced a little bit of what she presented. So it's an honor for me to be able to share some of that with individuals and to continue to explore and imagine how that might expand into our lives today. So I'll leave it at that. Thanks.
I was hoping to get a few index cards to prioritize the questions of folks. We got one. Really good. So good. Okay. All right. So the first question is for Annie. Where are the Gates bindings?
Oh boy. I will get exact numbers wrong. 7 at the Newberry, quite a number currently on view here, but in the care of the University of Illinois collection, Hull-House collection. 7 at the University of Chicago, 2 at the Pierpont Morgan, something like 20 in private hands. There got to be many more in private hands. One of the things I've been doing is writing to everybody I can think of, saying, are there any decorative leather books on bookcases? Because your grandmother was at Hull-House. And believe it or not, I found 2 that way. Through the connection, my mother said 6 years into this research, your great aunt would be so happy that you're interested in Ellen Gates Starr. Do you know they were friends? And I immediately wrote all of my cousins, second cousins, and third cousins, and found 4 more. Just like, is there anything on your bookcase? I found the one at the Ruskin. Her original book, I showed it, her first apprenticeship book, is at the British Library. There are 2 at the V&A, and so on and so on. They're wherever, some of them were sold to collections, some of them were given by people. The V&A, of course, was a teaching museum of design. And I think there are actually a fair number more out there. I would like to say that her kind of bookbinding was a practice, like yoga. It was a discipline. And it was slow. I think this is a wonderful part. But it was not an expression. Whereas the work that you're doing, I think, is an expression. And which is marvelous. But she was really looking at interpreting, embellishing, spending time with works of literature that were of deep value. And she refused commissions, even though she didn't have a lot of money. Or she would not okay the books that her students wanted to buy, because they were not worthy of their time. So the embellishment of books had to do with a kind of commitment to idealism. There were lots and lots of Ruskin and Morrises. So,
I have a follow-up question. Were the books ever sold to raise money for the program?
well, as you've probably learned already today, there was a lot of experimentation and change and incidental thinking. Ellen Gates Starr sold some on commission for her own income, and that's how she maintained her share of her wherewithal here. She gave a number. There were about 13 to 20. There's a debate here at Hull-House when she became an invalid in her 70s, and those were the exchange for her pension. So they were mostly, there were some changes in this. Those were sold in order to pay her later care, along with some contributions from friends. There were a set given. She found a complete set of Jane Addams' works, which were a gift to Jane / Hull-House. And those are some of those exhibited here.
A follow-up question. Why didn't Hull-House do letterpress printing, the binder's companion art?
Well, I know of, I think I know two reasons. One is that to maintain a press was extremely expensive. Buying a press and maintaining volatile inks, which were dangerous. And so, I mean, moving into printing was a whole other thing. And one of the motivations, by implication and a little bit of direct evidence, is that Ellen, who was not an artist, her sister was an academically trained artist, her aunt was a very important art historian and artist. She knew what excellent art was, but she was not it. She went into craft because of this ideological discipline of craft, but she thought she had better do it. The reason she chose bookbinding was that there were lots and lots of women in their houses in cottage culture, in the tenements, making gloves.
Oh,
And Mary Kenning was the organizer of those women into the Leather Workers Guild. It took a few years. And the hope was that bookbinding, which would get you fine art prices instead of glove prices, would be a way of augmenting income for people who went to business.
Was it?
No. Or rather, it didn't go, it didn't go long enough to know. I guess that's.
So I have a question here which anyone can address. What is the relevance of the location of Hull-House to African American participation versus attempts to reach the community otherwise, versus outreach efforts?
meaning, were they near any?
Yeah, right, so how did that sorting process work, or was it an outreach effort?
Well, I think that, this was both a neighborhood place but a gathered in place. So that, for example, the Hull-House Women's Club.
Speak up.
The Hull-House Women's Club. This was a place that was in the neighborhood and about neighborliness, but not necessarily restricted to just the people who were in the neighborhood. And in fact, the reaches of the programs were much greater in metropolitan Chicago. One of the most long-standing organized groups was the Hull-House Women's Club. And I have looked at the addresses of these women in the annual membership lists over time, and they very soon were people who were in Oak Park, people who were in the Austin neighborhood, which was initially an up-and-coming neighborhood for kind of a middle-class, kind of a city suburbanization kind of movement. There were people who were in Lakeview and so on. So that, and they came even, and Addams was surprised. And she commented a little bit about how this, people hung on, unquote, to this. Yes.
one of the things I think that in partial response to that is, when was the major influx of African Americans to Chicago? And it was halfway through into this period. The big migrations from the South was not until many of these things were very well established already.
Right, but on the other hand, the Lake Street corridor was a thoroughfare with a very cultivated and organized social community of African Americans that had commercial and social things going with it. As early as 1893, literary societies and other forms of cultural activities existed in what would have been Bronzeville, which was just literally a stone's throw. And it's not that black leadership of the political kind wasn't here. Ida B. Wells frequently lectured the very Hull-House Women's Club that I've just mentioned. So it's a very complicated story of why, for example, I compare it to the Greek community. The Greek community was less than 1,000 at the time in 1899 when Jane Addams hired a woman from Radcliffe to adapt a Greek play and work with the Greek community to put it on. So the Eurocentric aspect of Hull-House cannot be denied. It was here.
There's another short piece of that, which is that Hull-House is the famous one. Hull-House was the vanguard. Hull-House sparked people to count differently, and I need the local historians to help me here. There were between 13 and 20 settlements in Chicago. So there were, Mary McDowell and the community center, so that the idea grew, and for those who adhered to the idea that a settlement house was a place where people came with their educations to wait to see what might be of help and to survey what might be needed, the needs of different communities would be different. Now, I'm learning, there were African Americans here, but there were also other settlement houses working with African Americans, more recent Northern migration African Americans in other parts of the city. It is not an easy, it's absolutely Eurocentric, it's a very complicated issue, but I think we tend to put all of our eggs in one basket about what Hull-House did.
So this actually sparks a question that I have for Regin.
Yes.
Okay. And my question is, do you think, not to diminish how difficult it was to lose your space, but do you think that North Branch projects actually reaches more people as a delocalized project that moves through what look to be many different neighborhoods and contexts? I mean, is it perversely more effective as a...
Sure, I think that's a very interesting question, and definitely something that I've considered over the years. Albany Park was very specific because that's where I grew up, and it was important for me to have a place in that neighborhood because, I wanted to be there for the same types of people who, basically could be identified as my family members, my relatives, the people who I grew up with, and basically I identified with. Sure, we could set up the same kind of structure in different neighborhoods, and in fact, that's kind of what I'm doing at the moment because I don't have that very specific space. But I have to tell you, my goal is to be back in Albany Park, and in terms of effectiveness, it's not that important for me for the impact to be international. Like I talked about that workshop that I did in France. That's really cool, but quite honestly, if I could have a space where people can walk up and down the street and encounter kind of on a sort of just passing-by basis, where they're not intentionally going to there to make art, they're not intentionally going to encounter Because they've got errands to do, they've got lives to live, they've got children to take care of. And that's more important to me because it's reaching the kinds of people that I feel
So that's-
use it.
So that's your definition of effectiveness, is not a kind of globalized practice that gets kind of moved around the world generically, but is actually very, we had a time.
No, I wanted to add a comment.
Yes, go ahead.
But I just, because Regin is one of our really wonderful featured artists in the show, I also just wanted to respond to what you said about location, because it's not accidental at all that Hull-House, when it decentralized, had a presence in Albany Park too. And so part of the questions that we're getting at today are about legacy and where we are now with the work that was happening at Hull-House. And I think it's interesting that Regin didn't know necessarily about this history, but had created this project independently that has so many parallels and contrasts with the work at Hull-House. So I was hoping the panelists could speak to some of those contrasts and parallels of the work then and now.
Very quickly, I tried to make a small symbolic nod. As an art historian, it took me 20 years to decide it was really important to be present-minded. And that the work that we do has to be for the people who are alive now. And though I am very pleased that I seem to be a fellow traveler with Ellen Gates Starr for what's likely to be the rest of my life. She and Jane Addams and all their friends and the people who came to join them were present-minded people. And we should be too. And I tried to indicate that by using the colors from today's program brochures as the headings and the slides, to just remind you that this is what can we learn from them to do something now. And that they were not being traditional, they were not being Victorian, they were not being progressive area, they were trying to address social problems in the best, peculiar, innovative ways they knew how.
I just toss one more concept in there. I think that Addams and Humphrey
Could you speak louder?
Speak up.
I think that this stuff is about community also. And I think that that's, I'm really struck by everything you're saying, that you're saying, well, you can go any place and influence people, but that you yourself have a hunger for community and restarting your roots, and that's so much part of who you are. And I think that that's a large part of what Addams and Humphrey were doing also. Yes, it was, it was macrocosm in the sense that she influenced the world, but it was microcosm because it was the lessons that she learned here, and experimented with here, and worked with here, and in a lot of programs.
Yeah, I'll just add to that. One of the anecdotal things I sort of skipped out, which I think is very important, is part of the reason why North Branch began in the first place was because I had grown weary and sort of frustrated with my relationship with the contemporary art world. And growing up in Albany Park, art just wasn't a thing. I would go through 6 years of art school, which is, when you think about the contemporary art world, it is majority white. And white spaces, white cube spaces, kind of managed and dictated by a particular group of people. It wasn't as welcoming to a person of color. And so if I were to start a space, well, how can I say this? When I picked that specific space in Albany Park on Lawrence Avenue, it was away from the West Loop gallery scene. It was away from the North gallery scene. It was away from an established sort of hierarchy of space in the neighborhoods that already had established museum gallery spaces. It was for people who didn't normally encounter that kind of thing or make the effort to go to those spaces. So but that was a critical part of the beginnings of it.
Kim.
There's been a lot of questions about the African American artists and where they were, and I just wanted to, I used to teach at the School of the Art Institute that done work on the history of African Americans at the Art Institute. So, Archibald Motley was an anomaly to be very well known, but it really was, there were quite a few African American, relatively, students there. The earliest one was from 1863. Her name was Lonnie Moss. And I've been racking my brain, I had to look in my own books, bibliography, to find the name of this one artist a black artist there who wrote an unpublished autobiography about the black art scene here in the teens and 20s. And they even had like an art club that was on the South Side. And there was an interesting way in which those artists who could afford to actually go to their institute would come down to the South Side and transfer their knowledge. It became actually very routine at the South Side Community Arts Center once that was established. So there was, William B. Scott is probably someone you all do know. He went to the Art Institute. Elzier Porter came through, Elizabeth Kaplan. There are a lot of people who came through. And this artist, but I can't remember his name, he even wrote that he left the New York Art Students League because it was so racist and came to the Art Institute here and wrote that book essentially about how he was so accepted in Chicago more than he was in New York. And then about the settlement, where are the black settlements? The black churches really were the spaces where this type of work was being done for African American immigrants, coming from migrants, I should say, coming from the South.
So this actually raises, thank you so much, and it raises, I think, a really essential issue that comes up a lot in art history, which is the kind of hostility to religious feeling that dominates in the academy, and which has this kind of side effect of bracketing and isolating artists of color, but also artists not necessarily of color, who could or should absolutely be included in the ways that we think about religious experience and religious aesthetic experience, right? And I know that has played a role in Annie's research on Ellen Gates Starr.
In my life.
And your life, yes. Yeah. And it's an interesting bracketing that I think has done a lot of damage to the way the general public thinks about academic life.
May I tell a very fast something like 25 years ago, I was sitting around a group of American art historians at the College Art Association for dinner, and we were talking about how we'd gotten into American art history. And I said, I did it because I had a calling from God. And the room shut up, not just our head.
Well,
There's no question that there's no question that religion and an idea about, in the case of Addams, a humanistic religion, in the case of Storr, a community that had religious, intentional religious relationships with one another, framed the larger enterprise of their entire existence. Addams, in her classic work on the subjective necessity of settlement houses, which she first gives at a conference of people who are largely religious leaders in the social Christian movement at the time in Plymouth, Massachusetts. She talks about a renaissance that is happening. What kind of renaissance? It is of feeling. It is of being drawn to a kind of idealism of wanting to make their lives more, as people said about her, Christ-like. That's not accidental. It's not something that she ever gave up. I mean, later on she talked about her religious feelings in ways which were non-denominational, non-sectarian. And she thought that what she was doing here, which was to look at these, what she wanted to raise to be ethical values, because they were being put to work, had religious inspiration. I also want to add that there was no barrier for an African American to come and study here whatsoever. That is, I'm not intending to say that. There was no code or rule, right? Charles White, as a matter of fact, learned block printing at Hull-House. So we had, it was a complicated attempt. There were also attempts in the diverse settlement houses in Chicago to either have an interracial experience, as with the Frederick Douglass settlement, that was an attempt that Ida B. Wells and a woman by the name of Celia Parker Woolley attempted to create a place not for social work, but for social intercourse that would be interracial. And it was located closer to where Black people were living and white people were near. In the case of the Chicago Commons, which was near a Black community, and in the Addams Hull-House, when in 1908 it became clear that there could be value in creating a community center for Blacks, they had different choices. It was a Jim Crow world. I think we cannot understand any of this unless we understand that history. We're going into a different country. It is not the country we live in today. It is not the vocabulary we use today. And Blacks and whites evolved their ideas about what interracialism, integration, race meant. And at that time, the School of Civics and Philanthropy that Graham Taylor and Addams were were leaders of. It was like the Art Institute, open admission, and there were quite a few candidates who were learning social work at the School of Civics and Philanthropy. What is noteworthy is that these young women or men who would have been proper candidates for residency here weren't, did not become residents. Residency, except for Harriet Rice, who actually Lucy Knight had written about, I can tell you, was a white, was constructed as a white, generally European white enterprise here. And so what they did was to start the Wendell Phillips settlement, which was equidistant between Chicago Commons and Hull-House.
It wasn't.
It was in the middle. It was on the west side, but you know, I forget I don't know what the street address. It had an interracial board. It was producing, and this is an interesting thing. If you were a graduate of social work at that time and you were Black, where were you going to work? Well, you were going to be sent to a Black settlement house. It became the practicum, the place of internship for the women and men who were here in Chicago. A lot of the funding came from Julius Rosenwald, the person who was doing other things, which you could see the cup half full or half empty. He was building schools in the South for Black children. It was segregated. But without his money, would there have been schools at all? He was
Sears catalog
right.
allowed them to shop.
Right. Well, that's lately referred. But the other thing is that the Rosenwald Foundation was giving scholarships to almost every African American artist, social scientist in the United States. And in fact, when, after Addams' death in 1938, when a woman by the name of Charlotte Carr became the director here, she used the Rosenwald money to invite Dewey E. Jones and his wife Faith and their child, Dewey Jr., to be the first Black family that lived in residency at Hull-House. He was a journalist, and he was coming from basically the what was called the Black Council that was advising Roosevelt and Harold Ickes and so forth in Washington D.C. And he was here. But so it's a big story. In fact, it'll take a book, at least one. What's interesting is that we have avoided writing about it up until rather lately. I see Mary Jo Deegan is here, and she has written lots about race at Hull-House.
I think we're out of time.
I'm getting this.
Maybe we write you a check,
Yes.
or how do we do that?
Actually, we're in the stages of becoming an official nonprofit. So northbranchprojects.org is our website. You can always contact me through the website there, or come see me. I actually have some books if anybody wants to look at them in person. Northbranchprojects.org. And you can always contact me at Regin Igloria at email.
And Regin's also hosting a workshop this Friday, so directly after the.
Yes,
We're gonna make some books with it. It's gonna be in this very room from 1 o'clock to 3:45. So lunch is here, which is fantastic.